essentially finding somebody who's going to help you. So one of the things that I've really centered on is looking for people who are disgruntled or disaffected. So the theory is this, that the people who stand to essentially help you the most are people who are probably in positions where they're upset by something, they have access to people, and they have, for lack of a better term, an axe to grind. You have to be very careful with this, obviously, because those are also people who look to use you. But the reality is that these are also people who have access to information and documents and have reason to seek you out. They are people who, for whatever reason, feel like the system has failed them, and as a consequence, they want somebody to help them out. So part of the philosophy I've taken, especially when I started covering aviation security here, was to look for people on the outside who might know quite a bit about what's going on the inside, but aren't bound essentially by loyalty or by aspects of their job. It's a bit of a risky proposition, but for the most part, I think it works quite well. At the paper I used to work at, St. Paul Pioneer Press, there was a very good beat reporter who was covering the Minnesota Golden Gophers basketball team. His name is George Dorman. And George was a beat reporter just like anybody else, and started developing sources, and met a former tutor of the basketball team who had been removed from her job, and her name was Jan Gangelhoff. And Jan was in an interesting position because for years she had worked with members of the Gopher basketball team, helping them with their work. But the reality was that she wasn't just helping them, she was doing their work. And she told George this. And George, being the skeptical reporter that he was, realized that her saying that she had helped Gopher basketball players cheat in order to remain eligible probably wasn't a story that he could prove. And in part he couldn't prove it because it was going to be a he said, she said case. But as is often the case with disaffected and disgruntled employees, they keep records. And so what George did, and what I would encourage you to do, is when you find folks who sort of fit this bill, one of the things I always try to do is find out what they can document. Challenge them to prove what it is they're telling you. It so happens that Jan Gangelhoff kept a disc of all of the work that she had done for Gopher basketball players. But not just a disc. She also had finished assignments that had teacher comments and grades on them. For whatever reason, she had decided to collect these. What she was able to give George was both the copies of what she had done, including papers that she had essentially recycled year after year for players taking the same class, and also their graded assignments. Okay? George did a story on it, series on it. The basketball coach was fired, the program went on probation, and George won a Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting. The reality is that would not have happened had he not sought out people who were disgruntled and disaffected, and had he not sought to get the documentation to prove it. So whatever you do on that front, go after the documents. Now, you walk a very fine line here. When I was doing aviation security, my philosophy was that I was going to deal with a lot of people who had reasons to be angry with what the government was or was not doing with aviation security. But I also knew that all the documents that they had to prove up what they were doing were considered by the government to be security sensitive or classified. So I had to be very careful. I couldn't actually ask them to go get these documents for me, because to do so in some channels would be considered me soliciting somebody to break the law. So instead, I would simply ask them very clearly, is there any way that I can prove this? Is there any documentation out there? Okay? It is a very fine distinction, perhaps, but one I think that's important in what we do, which is to say, don't encourage people to break the law, don't direct them to break the law, but let it be known to them that it is very difficult for you to prove matters unless there is some documentation that exists. And so I think that the documentation part of this is very important, and if you look for sources who both have that sort of, if you want to call it an axe to grind, that's fine, but who can then support it with documentation, you will find that your stories will be much more solid. The second aspect of sourcing is create a source string. Now, what I've said on this front is, and I think most of you probably do this already, when you interview somebody, especially somebody you haven't met before, you might ask them at the tail end of the interview, who else can I talk to? The other way to use this is that if you develop those sources well, they become references for you. Again, when I was doing aviation security, I found people who were very disgruntled, had axes to grind, but also didn't know. They weren't on the forefront anymore. Perhaps they had left the agency, they weren't involved anymore. But the reality was that they still talked to a lot of people who who were. And those were the people I needed to reach, but whose names I didn't know, whose identities I didn't know. The reality is that when you find people who are disaffected, disgruntled, fired, dismissed, quit, whatever the case may be, they keep in touch with people who are still there. And the people who are still there often are their friends, and they are trusted. So if those people, the people who are out of the agency, out of the government, out of whatever institution you're covering, can vouch for you, they will be people who will help you connect with people who are in positions to be able to help you more directly. Okay? So oftentimes, if you work hard to develop those disaffected people, they can put you in touch with people who have much more direct access to things you want. The other thing that I think is critical, which I think probably goes without saying, but is really important, is you need to nurture your sources but not mislead them. Okay? We all have seen reporters who are beholden to their sources. They go beyond protecting their sources. They allow their sources to influence everything they do. And they perhaps go out of their way to make sure that they don't do anything that might piss off one of their sources. I think it's really important that you be very upfront with your sources at the start and explain to them what you do, why you're doing it, and what that means. There have been times when I have worked to dissuade sources from telling me certain things or giving me certain documents. Not in so much that I didn't want them, but because I thought it was important that they understood what was at stake. That is, if they gave me a document, I would say to them, let's be clear, if this document, if I publish this document, how many other people have access to it? Is this going to put you in peril? Okay? Is this going to be a situation where you could get fired because by me publishing this, it's going to tell somebody who gave it to me? Part of the reason I do that is because I think that these are human relationships. We have a certain obligation for people who trust us to show them that we essentially value that. But the other reason I think it's important is because I think it also builds trust. I think it creates an opportunity where people look at us, people who might supply us with information and say, okay, this guy isn't just using me. He really does care, and I think that that's an important component of developing that source relationship. Equally true, the other assurance I make to people I interview in sources is that they will never be surprised by something that they see in print that's attributed to them. They won't be surprised at the context of it. They won't be surprised by what I use. I think it's really important, and I do this for government officials, and I do this for anonymous sources if we use them, whatever the case may be. I think it's really important that we take our obligation to the sources and the information seriously. It's not enough to be a translator who accurately reflects the sentence and that was uttered. We have to be like a translator at the UN. We have to also get the meaning right. And so part of the compact here that exists between source and reporter in my mind is built around this idea that I want to help reflect what it is you're telling me. Okay? If I don't believe it, that's another thing altogether. But the point is there needs to be a trust that exists there. Okay? So again, the key would be look for people who are on the outside in. Look for them to help you make connections with people inside who can help you. Look for ways to document what they're telling you that go beyond a quote, especially if it's an anonymous one. Okay? And then make sure that you're telling them how you intend to use what they're going to give you and ensuring that the way you use it is proper. Simple as that. Before I go on to interviewing, any questions about the whole sourcing aspect? Okay. Interviewing. So I think interviewing is far more of an art than a science, and I think probably all of you would agree. And sort of the general basis where I start this discussion is that I think you need to know who you are and what you're about and what your personality is like before you can figure out what the best technique is for you.